Good morning, colleagues. My name is Prince Boy. I currently head up the Economic Empowerment and Participation in the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities. And thanks for joining in. May I start by asking my fellow colleague, Princess Kati, who assisted in organizing this meeting, just to give us the formal apologies received. And from there, then we'll then dwell into the actual business for the day. Thank you. Over to you, Princess.
Morning, colleagues. Apologies received were from our youth desk within the department, and another colleague from the Department of Transport, Ms. Patlani, has also rendered her apology. I've noted Josie, who has also indicated that she's gonna leave the meeting sooner. That's all that I received. Thank you.
Mr. Boy? Mr. Boy, Shalane here. I'd also like to register the apology of Ms. Charlotte Lobe from DERCO. She has sent me a message. She says that she's asked Ms. Karen Khomo to present on behalf of DERCO. Thank you.
Colleagues, I would really want to extend my warm welcome to every participant in terms of content-wise into this webinar seminar. It's a first of its kind for us as an economic empowerment unit. So there will be lots of teething problems, but I'm glad that I've got the whole team in the boardroom, and we're also observing what we call social distance of not less than 1.5 meters, not kilometers, colleagues. I see that I needed to acknowledge first all our presenters, and we've got a presenter from SIFA, Mr. Michael Zekwa. You are noted, sir. We also got Ms. Jose Rowe-Sets, and from the Gender Research Alliance, you're also noted, madam. We also got Marisa van Niekerk from Commission of Gender Equality. We also got Ms. Ayanda Bibi from the UN Women. We also got Mr. Wasim Karim from the National Youth Development Agency. And I think in terms of the main program, those are the speakers who are gonna be contributing to the content, right, of this webinar. My opening remarks really is just to give you a high level picture in terms of where we are, where we all got started it from. This webinar was necessitated from the inaugural meeting that we've had in the form of a launch by our minister in last year, November sometimes, where we really were looking at the role of developmental finance institution in terms of their mandate of advancing women economic empowerment as well as financial inclusion. We then resolved from that meeting to then say, if we really want to make a dent in that regard, our DFIs with their mandate, which really is about playing a critical role in terms of the country developmental objectives, we really need to make sure that we have a webinar of this sort to begin to track their footprint in terms of programs or projects which they have financed or they are financing towards the advancement of women in as far as women economic inclusion and financial inclusion is concerned, as well as furthering the job creation mandate of the government within the country value chains of the economic system across all sectors and as well as across all industries. Now, our participants, as you can see, they range from government or state departments, as well as our implementing agencies, and as well as going beyond what's currently happening within government, right? In other words, also touching on the role of private sector and civil society. We have, in packaging this webinar, very much mindful of the fact that the sectors that we are focusing on is the vulnerable. And that, in a sense, it's women in their diversity, the young, the old, and the disabled. Now, but also being cognizant of the fact that we are operating in the new normal, given the current circumstances in terms of the pandemic that we're all experiencing, the COVID-19. Therefore, our business won't be as normal. But also to recognize the fact that this webinar also takes place during the month of June, which really somehow demands us to reflect in terms of the struggles of the past towards emancipation in the broad sense. Now, you'd see that in terms of the program of the day, we also have the NYDA, which is an agency of our department, which also will be taking us through in terms of some of the programs and interventions that they have packaged together with other entities and the broader society as a whole during this month of the youth. Colleagues, having said that, I think my role was simply just to set the scene or the tone. And if you may allow me, basically according to the program of the day, which Shannon will be directing from where he is, we would really want to take 2 presentations at the same time. And the time allocated for presenters is between 5 to 10 minutes, but obviously we are a little bit negotiable. At the 10-minute mark, we would somehow raise a hand or ring a bell, but that's all dependent on Charlene from that side. And after the 2 presenters, we will then engage in the form of discussions. And when that slot arrives, you would have, or you'll be asked to raise your hand, and we'll then take 3 questions at a time. But obviously it's not about questions, but it's also about, contributing to the narrative. Shall I then stop right there at the moment while we are ushering in Mr. Michael Zekwa from the Small Enterprise Finance Agency, who will definitely take us through the programs or some of the interventions in terms of the relief measures and funding programs that they have been rolling out before COVID-2019, during, and also post. But also I think some of the key messages that we'll be looking up for would be, out of all those who are seeking or receiving that help, can we also be assisted in terms of understanding where that relief measures are focusing by way of somehow attempting to give us what we will normally call in our space sector, gender disaggregated data. And we shall be very much assisted if that data is positioned in such a way that we also understand the baselines, if there are. But in the absence of that, I'm sure it could also be like some work that could be done, or something that we can really look forward to then say, that's where we need to place it. Thank you very much. Can I allow Mr. Zek to come on board?
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Boy. And thank you for the platform that I've been afforded, as well as welcoming everybody on this webinar. I'm actually privileged from CIFA's point of view to have been the chosen one, at least by the department, to hold the fort, if you like. As far as this webinar is concerned, I think mine would be simple, and perhaps where I fall short, colleagues just alert me. In particular, Princess, I know that we have chatted a couple of times prior to this presentation. So where I fall short in terms of what Mr. Boy has actually requested, please can we engage post this webinar so that I can feel or forward some further information with regards to what's required. Without much ado, I don't know why this presentation says 11 December 2019. I thought I had changed the date, but my sincere apologies, colleagues, on that oversight. Can we get to the next page? By way of introduction, and the first 3 bullets really are just reiterating what this webinar is all about. But it's important to note, of course, given my prelude earlier, as far as what was requested of us as CIFA. One was to provide performance in the past or previous financial year, as far as inclusion of women with regards to financing is concerned. But I've also included, of course, the YPDs there. At the same time, the other point was to talk a little bit more about interventions with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic that CIFA has embarked on. Next page, please. I hope I'm audible enough.
Michael,
Okay.
you clearly.
Thank you. I think the first slide doesn't necessarily talk to what we, or rather I have indicated earlier, but nonetheless, it gives some sort of a pictorial presentation or illustration of how the organization has performed over the past financial year, in essence, so that we can at least give a perspective in relation to the numbers that talk specifically to the groups that we are talking about. So in a nutshell, we see that the first column, if you like, there talks about approvals. That's on the first KPI. And then it's got a reg indicator in the middle there, and then there's a spread of quarterly performances across on the right-hand side. Noting, of course, that the target is in dark gray for all the key indicators, and then the actual performance is in orange, if I'm not colorblind. Now, as far as our actual approvals are concerned against the target of 929 million, it was 1.4 billion. And the next KPI was actual disbursements to the businesses. It's 1 billion against a target of 793. And safe to say that on the third indicator, number of financed businesses, that's what it actually means. And we fell short there for various reasons that we can spend pretty much half a day talking about. But importantly, the jobs that were facilitated, this is basically jobs that were maintained or created, obviously noting the current, or the prevailing economic conditions in our country, high unemployment rate, et cetera, et cetera. So safe to say that before I move on to the next slide, these numbers actually cover a myriad of products that CIFA provide. To mention but a few, we have what we call the Isivande Fund that was launched, I think, late in 2018 in the Eastern Cape by our then Minister of Small Business Development. And then there's also normal CIFA products, which basically pretty much took quite a chunk of these figures. Normal in the sense of walk-ins that clients would actually come in to seek financing. Normal in the sense of, our day-to-day products, basically. There's a couple of other programs. There's the Small Business and Innovation Fund that was started or launched by our minister, the current minister, that is last year in November at Katlehong. Hello. Can I still continue? Or did I miss something? Shalon?
Please continue, Michael. I think somebody was unmuted. I've muted them. Please continue, Michael.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
Yeah, continue. We are listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then there is the EU program, basically wherein EU provided a kit in terms of financing, where CIFA basically matched one-on-one or one-to-one. I think it was to the tune of 450, if I'm not mistaken, odd million. So that particular fund, we have not as yet made any disbursements. So in terms of disbursements, it doesn't actually appear here. But as far as the approvals are concerned, partially it has actually contributed. But most importantly, there's the debt relief fund, which I will talk about on my last, I think, slide, as far as targeting the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. Among others, without wasting much time, there's also the land reform economic fund. Now, that land reform is partially capitalized by the Department of Land and Rural Development, and CIFA has basically been managing that. But in terms of continuity, it might actually come to an end, not yet confirmed, but there's some speculation to that effect. With that being said, Charlene, can you proceed to the next slide, please? Right, now with this one, we're looking at right at the top, the KPI to do with township businesses that were financed. Here we fell short quite terribly, but again, there's a number of reasons, but perhaps to mention key ones, you find that Michael would be sitting in Centurion, but claiming that he's got business, or indeed would have a business situated in the next township. But we find that when we dig deeper, in actual fact, it's just a business address, but the owner doesn't necessarily reside within the township area. So that's one biggest issue that we had there. Now, disbursements as the next KPI there, disbursements less than 500,000. Once again, we pretty much fell short there on the basis that there is a lot of the small businesses that basically do not necessarily comply, be it with the legislated compliance requirements, or indeed with issues to do with FICA, and quite a number of issues came up actually over there. The last one, or second last one, we're looking at persons with disabilities. Once again, the numbers actually fell very short. And the key reason, I think, there, as the colleagues engaged with us, was that they just simply couldn't find, businesses wherein the ownership resides with persons with disability. Allow me to move to the next one, colleagues. Right, the response as far as COVID-19 is concerned is basically outlined on this particular slide. Obviously, we heeded a call coming from our department, and initially we were looking at a couple of products as far as this fund was concerned. One was to deal with sustainability or growth of businesses during this pandemic, but the key one was the debt relief financing, which once we had received, I think, an initial 30,000+ applications, a directive came that we should actually focus all the efforts to the debt relief fund as opposed to growth financing. An amount of $500 million was basically committed towards this effort. And of course, the aim in a nutshell was to assist our SMMEs with working capital over this period, targeting 3 key elements of payroll, rental, and utilities. As I indicated earlier, around 35,000 applications were received, of which 14,400 odd were fully completed, and the balance, which was 21,000+, was referred back to SIDA basically support in terms of the technical or the softer side of things in terms of packaging properly or ensuring that there's compliance on the applications and the likes. So of those 14,450 odd, we picked up or we managed to approve 1,000, close to 1,500, which amounted to just north of R500 million. And the balance, therefore, from that 14,000 of the approved was 12,900 plus, which estimated to an amount of 4.4 billion, which is obviously way north of what the allocation was. That is now the R500 million amount. Now, in the main, we picked up that the requests were basically targeting salaries. And colleagues, I'm sure a number of you, if not all of you, might have actually seen the media release, which is dated, I think, the 22nd of May, coming from our department, talking about or indicating, of course, the performance of CFAD as far as this debt relief financing is concerned. And of course, ensuring at the end of the day that the balance that is required, that 4.4 billion to some extent, not necessarily in its entirety, is basically directed to UIF to assist with what we picked up as the key sort of requirement as far as salaries are concerned. And of course, there are further engagements with the National Treasury in this regard to see how best then to source the additional financing required for these purposes. I think in a nutshell, then that concludes my little presentation. But Mr. Boy, as I indicated earlier, the areas that we're actually looking at in terms of segregation, perhaps by programs, maybe provincial spread, etc. It is something that we'll have to dig deep in terms of finding that information. As I requested, if we could actually put that in writing so that one can be able to action it appropriately. I thank you very much.
Mr. Boy, you may come in. Mr. Boy. Hey.
Yes, Charlie?
Okay, yeah, now we hear you.
Yeah, now I was saying we are ready to take the second and the third presentations. And thanks to Michael, because the three presentations, somehow they're interlinked. And from there, we'll then open up the discussion for everyone to come in. Thank you.
Okay, next presenter, please identify yourself.
Hi, Charlotte, and it's Josie. I think I'm next.
Josie, your presentation again is the...
It's Women in Procurement.
Yes, okay. Just give me a second. I'm just getting to it. Apologies, colleagues. Just need to get to the presentation. Be with you shortly.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. There we go.
Have you got it, Charlene, or do you want me to put it up?
Yeah, no, I've got it. It was just about ending the other one. You should see it now, Josie.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Am I able to manipulate it, or will I have to ask you?
I think you'd have to ask me. Just try. I don't think you can.
No, I can't.
Okay.
Okay, cool. No
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
Would you like me to begin?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, colleagues. Some people I know well, and some people I don't know at all, but it's very nice to be here. And I'd like to thank the department for initiating something like this formally, because it seems that it's long been needed. And I'd love to see something like this happen on a regular basis, out of which improved action would come. I'm here representing the Gender Research Alliance. We are partners who focus on research onto gender issues. So one of the things we had to do last year was to work with UN Women and look at how procurement works for women. How does procurement work? Where do women fit into it? And what is their experience? Next slide, thank you. One of the first things that we did was look at the procurement landscape in general, not just for women, but for women too. And we looked at public and private sector participation. And what you're seeing here today is a very, very small portion of the report that was tabled with UN Women, where there are a lot of data. One of the things that we found, and I think the speaker alluded to it, is that in general, the data are not disaggregated by gender, and it made the job a little bit difficult. And one of our main recommendations emerging from that is that state institutions and anybody who's dealing with women in procurement or in any other area, the data need to be gender disaggregated. We were fortunate to be able to access some data from the central supplier database, service providers, which had some level of gender disaggregation, but not much. Anyway, what there is in the main report. It's important to note that South Africa is committed to gender equality. The implementation is poor, and we don't measure ourselves against goals. Obviously, with the exception of the previous speaker, where they are measuring themselves in specific ways. But most departments, most entities, private sector, large firms, the JSE don't really measure themselves against the SDGs per se. When this research was done, the economy was already pretty, but it was before the downgrades of Moody's, Standard & Poor and Fitch, and it was certainly before COVID-19. And now, of course, it's more and more, it's much worse. And latest South African Reserve Bank stats state that we'll probably see a drop of 10% in year-on-year GDP growth for 2020 and possibly 6-7% in 2021. It's very bad news for the economy, but on the one hand, on the other hand, it does represent certain opportunities for people. Sorry, I was just hitting a dog. It does represent opportunities for people who are able to provide services and the like. So in the public sector procurement landscape, it does implement preferential procurement, but it's entirely focused on race. When we looked at the numbers for Black women, we found that the allowance for being female and Black was much, much less than the allowance simply for being Black. So companies were not that motivated to procure from Black women-owned firms. It added very few points, extra points for them. The value there is about R500 billion, excluding wages and salaries. And if you want to do business with the state, you've got to register on the CSD. There's no measurement, and there's also no sanction for not reporting and not complying with goals and targets. And many, many women reported what they call sex for checks. So buyers in the public sector who'd say you can have the job, but I'd like some sex, please. In terms of the private sector procurement landscape, they're not reported by gender. It's about R1 trillion a year procurement spend, mostly large firms, but quite a few smaller firms these days. And the top 401 firms listed on the JSE are responsible for most of it. And the top 40 to 100 firms are responsible for over 70%. Essentially, you want to be, if you can be, you want to be part of the inbound supply chain or the service providers to those firms. The number of SMMEs owned by women is declining, except in a few sectors such as transport. Thank you very much, Charlene. When we spoke to women, because we conducted a lot of interviews and focus groups, and when we spoke to women-owned enterprises, we found that most of them are located in services, which things like logistics, security, transport. And I'm talking about agriculture here at the primary level. I'm talking about the other sectors. Very often they're necessity, what they call necessity entrepreneurs. They have to do it. They have no choice. They're not in business for themselves because they think it's a great idea. They're in business because their kids, or they have to eat, or the school fees have to be paid. Where they are formal, they do use Black economic empowerment as an entry point where it's viable. Geography matters. The closer you are to where the procurement happens makes a difference. We put people, women in rural or more rural or peri-urban areas at something of a disadvantage. Some sectors are more woman-owned enterprise friendly than others, as I'm sure everyone knows. And women-owned enterprises in general don't have good access to information about tenders that are out there for procurement opportunities. In terms of access, we're looking at competitiveness, price, volume, and experience. So if somebody's buying from an enterprise, this is what they want. They've got to be able to comply, registration, paperwork, financial checks, and the like. And in order to improve access along those ways, we're really looking at programs that deal with skills, finance. We're looking at the ability to implement some set-asides if we can, to help to pre-qualify and link women-owned enterprise procurement targets to the performance reviews of the department or the buyer in the private sector. Thank you, Charlene. So the women that access formal procurement opportunities, I'm not discussing here the informal environment, which is different, but the ones that access formal procurement opportunities, you get different types of entrepreneurs. So the first is the necessity entrepreneur. The second is the emerging entrepreneur, the person who maybe worked for a while and then thought, hey, this is quite good. I could grow a little bit and have a little bit more money. And then you have something that they call gazelles. And these are entrepreneurs who have hit on something, love what they're doing, and just grow and grow and grow until they hit that sized level. There are no real racial boundaries. Everybody, all women of all races access procurement opportunities. They tend to be over 35, urban because it's easier to access, usually good levels of confidence, a clear value proposition. They have good networks and they build relationships and trust, and they have high levels of social and to a lesser extent financial capital. Usually they have about 3 years business experience before starting up, and they tend to be subcontracted mostly. In other words, they tend not to be the main contractor on a procurement opportunity. They tend to subcontract to someone else. And in terms of the secondary and tertiary position in the value chains, it's where they largely locate. Thank you, Charlene. So sector procurement, not much disaggregated data. A lot of people enter through the central supplier database, lots of competition to get access, shorter timelines. Emerging SMMEs go for public sector opportunities if private sector demand reduces. However, there are real risks in dealing with the public sector because payments are often late or delayed for some reason that isn't really viable. A lot of red tape and bureaucracy to get a tender pack, or a tender under 500,000 rand often runs up to 30 pages. The value proposition when they enter is often centered around Black economic empowerment and not on a very clear value add market opportunity. Information about accessing procurement is easier in the public sector, but there are many, many more people, and it's not accessible to informal women-owned enterprises. If you're not formalized, you can't access it. Thank you, Charlene. In terms of the private sector procurement, the women we spoke to indicated they'd much rather be working and taking up opportunities in the private sector because they're usually paid on time, the terms and conditions are clear, and the like. But there are difficulties there too. So again, there's no sex disaggregated data. Uptake is slower. People feel preferential procurement is a must do, almost like a grudge thing. Industry-specific codes do yield positive results, and compliance is driving transformation. But there are limitations to how far certain sector global players can go and are willing to go. We found that supplier and enterprise development programs are very effective. To the extent that more and more women can plug into those supplier and enterprise development programs, they will do better in accessing procurement opportunities. It will also help women to build networks in industry and get involved. Once you're in there, there's a pipeline and you become trusted over time and you build your own networks. And of course, we've made the point that digitization will change everything, and mostly that means how people procure. There will be less personal interaction and more technical interaction. What we found, and we're just restating it here, I guess, is that equality doesn't equal equity. As you can see from our pretty picture, everybody is standing on the same box, but some people are just a bit shorter, or they're starting from a more advantaged position. And this is true of women overall, but it's especially true for Black women. Women-owned enterprises face significant additional barriers. So all SMMEs, men-owned and women-owned, face barriers in financing, accessing working capital, managing cash flows, accessing opportunity but women have additional issues, challenges that they have to deal with. Usually there's lower social capital and strong business networks because they haven't built them over time. There's lower mobility, it's the children, it's older parents, grandparents. There are what are considered women's duties in the home. The second shift, which is finish work, get home, cook dinner, do the washing. Every woman on the panel will know what I'm talking about. There's less time. Women are disadvantaged in terms of time because of the extra work that they do. There's a social and cultural bias in certain communities and families, whereas women, their priority must be the family. And okay, they can go out to work, but the family must always come first. And that isn't always conducive to doing good business. And it isn't always useful for good enterprise management. We found many women lack confidence. They don't believe they can do it. They don't know enough about it. And as a result, they think they're worse than their male equivalents and colleagues. And we all found that that's not true. There is a lower inclination to take risks. Women are less risk-taking, which is, of course, why we pay lower insurance premiums for our cars. And they tend to focus more on the balance. Thank you, Charlotte. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So how do you overcome the barriers? There are barriers on the supply side and on the demand side. So the issues for women-owned enterprises in terms of the supply side, limited or wrong networks for accessing information about procurement and procurement opportunities. They just don't have the strong networks or the right networks. They don't have the same networks that men do. Also, women's position in the economy means that many of them have lower levels of enterprise and management experience. And then finally, women-owned enterprises and supplier diversity programs are working for women-owned enterprises, is to some extent of some assistance. At the end of the day, what do we need? We need capacity building to develop and use procurement networks. We need to actively link women into existing procurement networks that are relevant to what they do. Enterprise training should be targeted at procurement for women-owned enterprises, and women-owned enterprises should be mentored by experienced people in procurement. Supporting women-owned enterprises to develop appropriate business models. Credit gets tighter and tighter, the business case gets tougher and tougher, and the development of a clear and distinct business model becomes an absolute prerequisite. And link into commercial sources of finance that meet their needs. let's talk about meeting needs. Very often the women-owned enterprises don't need large amounts of capital to start up, but they need financing to bridge them when the invoice is paid late, which it often is by government departments, and also finance based on business assets or intangibles, which the credit committees of banks really don't like. If you don't have a hard physical balance sheet, it can be a serious problem. And then linking women into supplier diversity programs. Thank you, Charlene. In terms of accessing demand, overcoming gender-based barriers, influenced by a combination of political will to procure for women as a strategy at top management level, and having the capacity to do so. Gender bias often exists in operational management. Oh, she's a woman, the kids are more important, she won't work late, she might miss a meeting, things like that. Supplier diversity programs, however, at the moment are offering opportunities for women-owned enterprises. For example, there's a very good one at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange with a specific focus on women. Some of the mining companies are building specific programs that focus on bringing women into supply chains and enterprise services. So these things are, we found, easily one of the most effective, practical, available means of accessing women into procurement quickly and effectively. And they usually offer a systemic support program. So where the woman might not be great at managing cash flow or not great at keeping stock or whatever it is, would then be supported and mentored in that area. So enter the supplier development programs. That becomes very important, and any program that can facilitate that entry for women-owned enterprises would be a significant success. You'll also find that the large firms will often finance the cash flows, which means state funds don't really need to do that. Preferential procurement in terms of well-regulated industry codes. One of the sources that we used extensively was the BBBE Commission annual report. And that research is typically outsourced to a research firm to do. And we found that there were almost, the level of response on the reporting that the firm was able to report for the annual report was very low. In other words, people didn't bother to respond. And consequently, some of the research simply wasn't generalizable. You just couldn't say what the reality was. So not many of the industries have industry codes, and there's a lack of consistency of application. But there are also limitations to how far the private sector can go, but still it can do it. So we need some capacity building for buyer firms and clusters to encourage the development of preferential procurement for women. And then closed procurement networks. We need to be able to access those networks because these socioeconomic norms are gendered. Well-established economic, commercial, and cultural networks tend to mean that buyers don't look beyond who and what they know. And buyers need to be encouraged to start being inclusive of women-owned enterprises because they don't know them. In the private sector especially, many businesses have long-standing relationships and don't really want to change, even if the woman-owned enterprise has all the credentials. So supporting enterprise registration on procurement platforms, encouraging outreach programs from buyers, and promoting evidence-based advocacy are all things that can be done. Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, everybody. In sum, it's if you're a woman-owned enterprise, you will have all the issues to deal with that any SMME or startup will have, and on top of that, you're going to come up. There are significant, practical, available opportunities out there. And the real issue is how do we get women in to access that 1 trillion rand a year that the private sector spends and a $500 billion a year over 3 years that the state spends. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you, Charlene.
Colleagues, thank you very much to Josie. We may have to adapt our program a little bit because I'm cognizant of the fact that Josie has to leave. Actually, she was meant to have left the platform around 9:45. So can we only engage with her presentation? I'm very much well aware that you also have maybe comments to make based on the first presentation, but we just have to accommodate Josie at this present moment. And we'll get back to Sifa's presentation after we've taken the third one. Can I then have an indication by show of hands? And probably I think Max would like to take 3 questions, but colleagues, it's not necessarily about, it's not a Q&A session, right? So we also welcome contributory comments to advance the economic inclusion and empowerment of women. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to make my comment / question. My issue is the same for both the previous speakers. I imagine Michael will respond when he gets an opportunity. We are aware that women is not a homogeneous group, and therefore women with disabilities also have the same challenges, if not compounded, in terms of the presentation that was made. I'm just wondering whether there's differentiated strategies in order to ensure that women with disabilities are also a part of the database, as well as all the strategies that are being employed to make sure that they are involved in the procurement opportunities. Also, the Department of Treasury does have a tracking system where we 2 years ago were able to get information on beneficiaries with persons with disabilities. It's just recently that they've been revamping their system, and I'm happy to share with you the contact that we have at Treasury. Thank you.
Just to respond, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, so our mandate or our brief was to look at, for UN Women, was to look at a typology of women-owned enterprises that would facilitate and improve access to procurement. In the detailed report, we do take note of intersectionality, but we haven't quantified the various different categories of women, if you like. We're aware that it needs to be done, but it wasn't part of what we did. I think also the only thing that I can say that we did look at in terms of breaking down the blob, if you like, of definition for women-owned enterprises was we broke them down by the size and stage of enterprise that they were involved in, by the sector that they were involved in, and by type of service or goods that they offered. And consequently, we did not break out the specific needs and requirements of women with disabilities, although the report makes reference to the fact that this work probably needs to be done. Pile, I hope that answers your comment, and I firmly agree with you that the detail of the needs varies between different women in rural areas, for example, have another set of needs as well, and different challenges on top of what everybody else has. Thank you very much, Shalin.
I'm Nomvula Tsatsi from the Department of Trade and Industry, working under the BEE Chief Directorate. Thank you very much, Josie, for the presentation, and also from Sifa. You know, it actually like really shows that there is still a lot of work that must be done in this particular space, because then you are having a lot of levers. But then in terms of packaging those particular levers to unlock the opportunity, sometimes that's where the challenge is. I noted that you actually like, you know, like said 2 statements that were sort of contradicting each other in a way, because you are saying the value proposition around BEE was not an ideal within as a market opportunity. And at the same time, you actually like said the sector codes were actually like quite effective in terms of integrating the women. And I mean, like, this is where I actually like really say that, you know, like we need to pull up our sleeves in terms of working to untap that particular opportunity, because the actual BBBE legislation has got a lot of provisions that were meant to empower women to be fully integrated into the various sectors of the economy. But then I think what we are feeling or falling short on is the identification of areas and having specific programs that we can target the integration of those women, like using the legislation, you know, around your enterprise and supplier development. Which companies can we actually like really target? And then go and target their enterprise and supplier development commitments in terms of integrating women within those particular areas. And I mean, like, you know, this is one area that, you know, like I think would be quite interesting to actually like unpack and make sure that we can then track the impact of that particular intervention. You also mentioned that, you know, like, I mean, there is a need to have like clear clusters for women, and I concur with that idea, because, you know, if you do not sort of know exactly how you position yourself in terms of you know, which area to target, it becomes a bit of a problem. And then Simi, it would actually like be very nice if you could share the National Treasury contact for the integration of women that are living with a disability to be integrated within the economy. Thank you.
Is that I'm Mapule Pora from the National Development Agency, and usually we work with cooperatives and NPOs. And in both presentation, I didn't see, because most women have established cooperatives, especially in rural and peri-urban areas. And both the presenters didn't say much about that. So I don't think there's a need for a response now, but to say in future, can you also find ways, especially for SIFA, to say, how do we assist those women to be part of the mainstream economy? Because they are doing, and some of them are in production, like in agriculture, and some of them are in the sewing and textile industries. So those are my inputs. Can we also find ways to say those who have already, because remember when ministers go out, they've said to women, establish yourself into cooperatives so that it will be easier, and some of them that even registered in the central database, but they are still not part of the mainstream economy. Thank you.
Would you like me to respond, Charlene?
Please, Josie.
Okay, so Nomvula, hello. Nice to hear your voice again. In terms of the BBBE code comment that you make, it wasn't the intention to be contradictory, but perhaps I wasn't clear. In fact, I'm fairly sure I probably was whizzing through the presentation. There are codes, and they vary from sector to sector. And of course, as you know very well, in transport, there's like about 6 different subsector codes, because each of the transport subsectors is a bit different. What we found in the research, rightly or wrongly, was that there was less interest on the part of private sector entities in gaining points, additional points for involving Black women-owned enterprises in procurement. So the points are obviously for being a Black South African, and there was in some subsectors an extra 3 points if it was a Black female, in others an extra 8 points. But in general, the points that they could get were lower than the points that they could get by investing in an enterprise and supplier development program, which didn't necessarily have any women quotas in there. So the codes are fine, but they are not sufficiently incentivizing for private sector, and even frankly for government procurement. Many departments don't specifically look out for Black women-owned enterprises. So there is, as you say, work to be done in that area. Your second comment around targeting, I think, is absolutely critical. One of the things that we said in our report was, if you want to start really feeding women into private sector, start with the top 70 companies on the JSE 400. Because they were, 40 companies, because they're responsible for 70% of all private sector procurement in South Africa. Many of them cross a large number of boundaries, and most of them are signatories to the SDGs as well as to the JSE commitment to the SDGs. They also have the money to double or sometimes even triple their enterprise and supplier development programs. So our suggestion was that private sector targeting might want to begin there. And then to my other colleague who raised the issue of cooperatives, from our perspective, we have done work in cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives and the like, and in the cut, make, trim type of situation. But it was not part of this brief, and we did not specifically look at procurement. So I know that UN Women has a desk that looks extensively at this, but it wasn't part of the work that we did. Thank you.
I was just saying thanks to Josie and all the contributors who came in. And I think in the spirit of this meeting, it was not just simply Q&A, but there was a very valid voice around sustained programming and also sustained interventions towards bringing women in all diversity, the young, the old, and disabled into the mainstream, not forgetting different sizes of company and makeup of those companies, your SMMEs and cooperatives. I would therefore, colleagues, suggest that we take the third presentation, and after the third presentation, then we'll reflect, right, back to third as well as the first presentation. And Josie was made aware or informed that you might leave the meeting at any given point. But thank you for gracing us here on this platform.
Sure.
Just to briefly outline that the CGE is an independent institution that has been established in terms of Chapter 9 of the Constitution, specific reference to Section 181 and 189 of the Constitution. Our powers and functions then derives from the Commission for Gender Equality Act number 39 of 1996. We have got quite a broad mandate in relation to gender. We welcome the opportunity to make a presentation that relates to the inclusion or the economic inclusion of women in public procurement. Now, during the financial year 2018-19, we conducted an investigation into public procurement and we produced a report. Now, that report is relevant to the subject of today. During the financial year of 2019-20, we conducted follow-up hearings with the departments to monitor the progress and the implementation of those recommendations. Now, just as a brief highlight, some of the rationale for the hearings was to assess compliance of various public departments, to assess the impact of procurement processes and policies on the women in the public sector, to raise the awareness of the international commitments, to assess what measurements have been put in place in the workplace to bring about transformation in terms of gender and procurement, and then also look at policy gaps and to advance women and people with disabilities in terms of employment equity as well. So if we go to the limitations and some of the solutions that we highlighted in the report, is that the departments that we assess generally demonstrate a lack of effort to integrate gender as a fundamental component in their procurement practices. We espouse that the transformed procurement practices would result in ensuring equitable access and provide benefit by diversifying the supply chain. We noted with concern that there's minimal compliance with the Employment Equity Act. Some of the departments are still male-dominated, especially at top and senior management. The same applies to people with disabilities, as they also remain very marginalized
Constant monitoring of departments is required to achieve compliance and transformation in the workplace. The Commission found further that some of the departments did not incorporate gender markers into ongoing reporting and KPIs. We therefore recommended that the departments include in all the senior managers' contracts and KPIs gender and equality markers. This demand not only commitment but also compliance and monitoring. The Commission found that departments do not request their suppliers to provide their gender and diversity policies and include it in the criteria for business selection. We further found that the departments do not analyze its existing supply chain to establish a baseline of women suppliers and entrepreneurs doing business with the departments. We further then recommended that the departments do same. A further finding that was done by the CGE was to say that some departments do not operate in line with the Women Empowerment Principles 2, 5, and 7 as set out by the UN. That is, ensures sufficient participation of women of 30% or greater in decision-making and governance at all levels and across all business areas. It has not expanded business relationships with women-owned enterprises, including the small businesses and women entrepreneurs, do not measure and report on progress, both internally and externally, and is not using disaggregated data by sex or gender, and do not incorporate gender markers into ongoing reporting obligations. The department should procure more of their goods and services from local manufacturers as opposed to international manufacturers. Can we turn the slide, please? We further found that the departments do not encourage and work with suppliers that adopt policies and practices that support quality, health, and hygiene for both male and female employees, especially when procuring services. We therefore recommended that the departments do same. We found that some of the departments do not track the number of beneficiaries from community projects and initiatives that is disaggregated in terms of gender. We also recommended that that must be looked into. We recommended that departments conduct workshops and training to employees on the aim and implementation of the PPPFA, BBBE, and the procurement transformation or refresher workshops on same. And that refers specifically to the guidelines set by the regulations in PPPFA, in where you can deviate from your number one performer when you do the evaluations. These trainings will not only empower the employees, but it will also enhance their competency in the procurement processes of the departments. The Commission did not find policy gaps and systemic barriers experienced by the departments in their procurement practices. There are international and domestic procurement prescripts put in place to promote gender transformation. However, the departments are reluctant to comply with the prescripts, disadvantaging women from benefiting economically. We recommended that the department put the measures in place for monitoring and evaluation and compliance purposes. These hearings that we held then also raised awareness to the departments on relevant international and domestic commitments and the importance of compliance. Can we turn the slide, please? In terms of government implementation of procurement policies, we recommend that a similar study or investigation may be utilized by government to monitor and implement the PPPFA. Such a study will assist the government to identify non-compliances and best practices. The recommendations that was outlined and made by the CGE in the report may also be considered by other departments to ensure compliance. Then in conclusion, next slide, thank you. The CGE 2018-19 follow-up report highlighted that women are gradually making strides in men-dominated areas, such as rendering services on design and construction of houses with basic infrastructure. And in this regard, we refer to houses, energy, sanitation, water, fencing, access roads, and the like. And also, in terms of installation of palisade fences at schools and municipalities, there were a couple of those as well. We observed that the National Treasury regulations do allow departments to be proactive and achieve national objectives, while at the same time ensuring that policies are compliant. An overall observation confirms an average compliance of departments with Women Empowerment Principle 2, in that more women were appointed at SMS level during the follow-ups. The principle further provides for equal opportunity, inclusion, and non-discrimination. Departments should strive for greater compliance in respect of the bid committees, where actual impact should be measured. The importance of gender sensitization of ECM staff and specifically bid committees is important, and it's important from the aspect to understand the triple PFA as well as the regulations that goes with it. It's imperative that people understand that gender equality measures to advance women in male-dominated areas are not to be perceived as discriminatory towards men. And we would then like to thank the department for the opportunity for their presentation, and we hope that it will assist the department in the execution of the mandates and the advancement of women in the economy. Thank you, Charlene.
Presentation from CGE, Marisa, specifically. I think it also underscores the common thread message that we've had from the previous presenters, as well as the contributors who came in. And I think to summarize it all, the common thread from where I sit, it seems to be the fact that we keep on lacking, or at least we are behind, in terms of the gender disaggregated data. And where it exists, probably it's not being analyzed. And I think from the investigations that CGE has conducted, they also bring up a new dimension, which is not supposed to be new at all, because there's a policy that really directs that. The need to always emphasize on local procurement. And we are quite aware that there are sectors which are designated, which really make it mandatory for public entities to procure from home-based companies in terms of geography and production capabilities, as well as including using what we call local labor. Having said that, can I then allow 3 contributors, and I keep on saying contributors, because certainly we really need contributions which will also assist everyone else to achieve that paradigm shift that we all seek to achieve or want to achieve at this point in time. So back to you, Charlene, and you'll definitely usher them in as and when they show their readiness by ushering or maybe raising their hands. We will then limit it to 3 contributors so that immediately afterwards, we move into the last 2 presentations, then open it up again for a broader discussion before we could wrap up. Thank you, Charlene. Yeah, that would be UN Women, Miss Ayanda Vivi, and who will then be followed by the NYDA CEO, Wasim Karim. Can we then take them in that order, please?
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Ayanda Mvimbi. I'm the head of the flagship program for stimulating equal opportunities for women-owned enterprises at UN Women, the South Africa multi-country office. I'm very pleased to be joining this conversation this morning, and I want to thank the department for facilitating this conversation at such a critical time in our country. The topic of we're focusing on today, we're focusing on tracking the exclusion of women in all sectors in the different components that have been highlighted, is timely, and it is important because if you look at global statistics, women-owned enterprises are excluded from millions of dollars of contracting opportunities. And at UN Women, globally, we are actively promoting gender responsive procurement, which is the integration of women in various procurement opportunities. We believe that this has transformational impact on both the domestic and international markets, and it will contribute to women's economic empowerment. But if you look at the size of public procurement and the lack of participation of women in public procurement is evident, and figures the range from 1% to 8%. The figure that we have for South Africa is looking at not more than 10% of women accessing procurement opportunities in the public sector. We do not have data for the private sector, which is also has a huge procurement budget that could potentially be able to shift the current status quo. And the important question as we having this conversation today, but also as we are thinking about what we need to do, is why does this trend continue, the lack of participation of women, and what more should we be doing to ensure that we increase the participation of women in accessing markets and accessing business opportunities and increasing their wealth. The second slide, please. And this is important because we need to remind ourselves of the commitment that we have made with the Sustainable Development Goals in addressing the root causes of poverty and the universal need for development that work for all people. And as UN Women, we are responsible for goal number 5, which focuses on gender equality. We know and understand that gender equality and women's empowerment are indispensable in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. 2030 is upon us. We need to measure how much ground we have managed to cover to ensure that we are achieving gender equality, and we need to be looking at the different indicators. One important indicator that we need to be looking at, in particular for this, is the fact that millions of women are still trapped in low-paid, poor-quality jobs, and they're even denied even basic levels of healthcare services, and they carry the burden of unpaid care work, and in most instances, they participate in low economic field, which does not necessarily reward them of their time and investment that they make. It is important, therefore, that we need to be looking at the gender gaps in wealth and income. We need to ensure that we focus on labor force participation, access to decent jobs. But also a very important strategy is enabling environment to create women's entrepreneurship and support them in accessing different markets. Next slide, please. And this is because we have strong evidence and data on why this is important. The UN Secretary General High-Level Panel Report on Women's Economic Empowerment done in 2015 looked at best ways to unlock power of women to work and achieve their financial independence, and made concrete recommendations of what needs to be done to improve economic outcomes for women. And what you see on the screen are the key strategies. And if you see building assets, procurement, are key drivers of change that we are working towards. So we need to start looking at the different components of if the economy works for women, what it would look like. UN Women Progress of the World's Women's Report documented ways in which current economic policies are failing women in rich and poor countries alike, and also started to think about what would the economy look like if it truly worked for women. I think the first thing that's really important is ensure equal access to opportunities and resources for women, starting with the equal pay, access to land, social protection, are some of the key considerations that we need to be looking at. Addressing the gender stereotypes, stigma, and violence, I think Josie in her presentation was talking about all SMEs are experiencing different challenges, but if you add the gender discrimination layer to it, the issues become worse than these, and some of these include the issue of how the women participate in economic decision making, from having a voice in how their time and money is spent, to ensuring that they are allocated sufficient and appropriate resources in their national economies. And the current crisis that we have, the COVID crisis, and we saw what SIFA has presented, and I'll come back to that. It is important to ask the question, to what extent women-owned enterprises have benefited from the current relief funds, and what's the implication of that? And is it helping us to march forward with our vision of ensuring that women have access to equal resources, respect, and equal voice in the economy? Next slide, please. And I think, I mean, in all of this, the value proposition is very clear. If we look at the size of opportunity that exists for women to benefit from the economy, and if you look at the figures I've just shared with you on the screen, those are significant amounts, and there's a significant opportunity. And if we were to just, even at a minimum, manage to shift 1% of what we already have to the hands of women-owned enterprises, that will lead to significant shifts. And if you look at the size of the economy in South Africa, and how much both the public sector and the private sector are used in one year to buy goods and services. But also, I think the important question is how much of that goes to women-owned enterprises, and how much of that does not go to women-owned enterprises. And this is important because if you look at the potential of the amount of money to the tune of 500 billion that's circulating in one financial year, and if we can just imagine what that could do to our economy and communities and families and different households, if that money shifts to the hands of women-owned enterprises. It will be important, once again, to look at all the resources that have been invested in addressing and managing the COVID crisis. In particular, access to essential services, and PPE materials, sanitizers, and all of that. And all the procuring agencies, the amount of money that they have invested in this is a lot of money. It will be interesting for the department to track how much of that has actually gone to the hands of women-owned enterprises, and which women-owned enterprises. What is the situation, for instance, in rural areas, different townships, where are these goods and services being procured that service those particular communities is again important question. We have at UN Women good examples of different contexts of how government, for instance, in Kenya, has used the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act, which provide different forms of preference and reservation of public procurement. Like in South Africa, it reserves no less than 30% of procurement of the goods and services to designated groups, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. But the following up and supporting and mentoring of these ensures that the shifts were able to track the shifts, and but also in an 18-month period, they managed to track the women's income went from an average of 200 rand a month to 2,000 a month. And if you look at that, that is quite significant. And I think if we are deliberate of applying what currently exists in our legal and policy framework, we will be able to see some of these significant gains we are working towards. Please, next slide. I think one thing that I want to really highlight here is the fact that we're still way far behind in ensuring both economic and financial inclusion. There is a lot of data that's supporting this. But so we need to be thinking about what this means for our strategies to take things forward. And there are clear indications of what we need to be investing in more, which includes creating an enabling and supportive environment for entrepreneurship, looking at extension of savings and credit. Insurance is a big one, and also paying service providers on time is quite significant. And these are the strategies that will not only reduce the gender gap that currently exists, but also help the economy to grow as well. Next slide. I wanted to talk about South Africa, and because South Africa is really critical if you look at where our upper middle income country, we have 34 banks, including 15 foreign subsidiaries. We have very strong regulation on the financial sector. The pension fund is quite diverse, and a lot of that. There is all but little data of how much of that covers specifically women-owned enterprises. And I think that one of the key important interventions from this seminar is how we strategize for the coalition of data. Because if you look at my next slide, please, next slide. The FinScope survey, which was conducted in 2016, and it highlights that exclusion of women from financial services leads obviously to exclusion from social and economic activities. And one of the things that the study documented the gender gap in financial inclusion, and just looking at the SADC region, was the access to accounts and savings and credit using. And one of the things that it highlights is that females are less banked than males with a 6% gap. But also one of the very important things that the study highlights is the issue of the actual use. And they made an example for about South Africa, which obviously, as you know, most beneficiaries of the social grants, they use bank accounts for transaction to receive, but most of the activity that is there is for cash withdrawal. And obviously the impact of high unemployment, high cost and transaction costs in opening accounts and managing them prevents people from using the system of banking. And you need to be looking at what is the appropriate system, financial system that we should be looking at. Should we be using the existing? Should we be exploring the alternative? Should we be thinking about key consideration in relation to the regulatory framework in relation to that? And how do we support the informal sector businesses that do not have access to more of these formal mechanisms to access the services? And so please go to the next slide. I think similar to what Josie presented in terms of the barriers to this, we know they are structural and they are gendered, and they are both on the demand side in terms of how policies and practices are framed and used to support inclusion, but also on the supply side, the big gaps around capacity, information, technology are some of the critical things that we need to be focusing on and looking at in addressing some of these discriminatory practices in the labor market. I think what is also really important, and what I want to highlight here, is that women in the informal sector have no protection against shocks such as COVID-19, because a part of the missing middle, they don't qualify for social grants, but they're also not in the position to run profitable their businesses. And how do we then address their needs? What do we need to ensure that crises like this, like COVID, is mitigated with the relevant and appropriate support to ensure that their situation does not become worse off. When I was thinking about what then needs to happen, and there are key questions that we need to start asking, and hopefully they are the right questions, because they will lead us to the right solutions. If you look at the business rescue packages provided by government during this current COVID crisis in the various sectors, including SMMEs and agriculture, etc., we had the presentation from SIFA about what has been put aside, how many people have actually accessed the required support, the relief support, and how many have not been able to. About 2 weeks ago, Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development also announced the result of the disaster fund that the department put in place for farmers. And in total, they received about 55,155 applications. And what was really interesting is that 33,000 of those were manual application. So we need to commend the officials for supporting the process of manual applications because, as we all know, most farmers and some of the businesses do not have access to ICT tools, or they're just simply not affordable. But what I want to highlight is the result of what they were able to provide in terms of this support. So 15,000 applications were approved, and of that, about 5,494 were women, 2,493 youth, but the sex disaggregation was not provided. 224 were people living with disabilities, and again, not disaggregated by sex, and 9,542 were males who accessed the support. And we have had the amount that went to, what will be useful before I go there is, which I did not quite get from Michael from CIFA, is how much of the relief funds they distributed went to women-owned enterprises, and where it will be interesting to get that data. I also want to highlight that these rescue measures have, of course, excluded or missed many women in the sector who are operating in traditional in sectors traditionally dominated by women. The salon owners, cosmetology, tailoring businesses, and whilst we know that all businesses are facing risk of closure and downscale during this time, the situation for the informal sector, in particular women businesses in the informal sector, is huge, and we need to be looking at what mechanisms we need to be putting in place to ensure that we close the gap. It is critical that we do this, because if the danger of not investing in this and mitigating the impact is that the impact will be huge and severe for many communities and for many small and micro and informal sector, but also for businesses that are not accessing many business opportunities. We need to be thinking about, in the current relief packages, where are the gaps and how do we close and support those gaps to ensure that we continue with wealth creation initiatives and address gender disparity in economic activities. Next slide, please. And I want to conclude by just reiterating some of what you already know, and state that there is a very strong case for women's economic and financial inclusion. It's part of the broader transformative agenda. Transformation will not happen if we exclude more than half of the population. I think when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, the principle of no one should be left behind also means no woman should be left behind. there must be concerted effort to ensure that at the base of the economic pyramid, we are able to deploy the correct and relevant and appropriate strategies to ensure that we do not increase the already existing gender gap in relation to this, and that we are also deliberate in how we want to change the status quo. I do not think that it is for the lack of good examples of how this can be done. I think what is really important is for us to be more deliberate in our efforts to ensure that we do not make the situation worse. Thank you very much for listening.
Colleagues, also just to take this opportunity to welcome those who might just have joined since we started from 9 o'clock. But basically for us here as a department, the UN Women presentation also underscores the fact that we are part of the global village. And therefore, as part of our growth strategy, it's also to look at the emerging markets. Basically, what I mean by that is how then do we turn this COVID-19 pandemic into an opportunity for all of us as we continue our struggle to build an all-inclusive economy, obviously in favor or positively favoring those who we term vulnerables, which include our women, youth, and persons with disabilities. But also the presentation touched very much so on what is it that we need to do collaboratively, like in the sense of all of us in the public space, as well as private sector, including civil society, to improve access to information, access to finance, and also access to markets. But also, I think, by way of concluding from what I could pick up, is that we are now in the era of the new normal, and things cannot continue like they used to be. So definitely, we need not to be apologetic about the need for all of us to have all hands on deck to come up with proposals that will assist in disrupting this economy, in the sense that during now COVID and also moving into post-COVID, we are able to then say or put concrete proposals that will really ensure that we build an inclusive economy. But also just to remind everyone who's in attendance or taking part in this meeting that South Africa, we assumed the AU chairship as of January this year. And our president declared that during his term and the decade thereof, our focus should be on women, financial inclusion, and economic empowerment. So we should always keep that message or shine some spotlight on that. And following that, we also signed lots of agreements, but one in particular that I really want to highlight is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. What sort of interventions or programs are we designing that will benefit the most vulnerable? Because it cannot be an economy that only caters for the elite. I think with those few words, therefore, we would like to bring the CEO of NYDA, and I've already indicated in my opening remarks as I was welcoming everybody that this is also a milestone in our history, because we are holding this in the month of the youth. And the struggle that we face, or our youth face, is a different one. And I think this also ushers a new opportunity for that sector and everyone else, because I think this meeting is a clear demonstration that if things were normal, we would have been confined in a physical space. But because we are now operating under a new normal, we have to come up with new thinking, and that economy that would really cater for new ideas, ideation, and creativity is the one that it's currently upon us. In those few words, Charlene, if you could assist us to roll the presentation for Mr. Wasim Karim to come on board, and we'll then open it up again for a broader discussion immediately after him. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Mr. Karim is unmuted. Mr. Boy, I'm going to mute you, and Mr. Karim, I'm going to bring up your presentation.
Cool. All right, good morning, everybody. Let me take this opportunity to wish everybody a good Youth Month, even under these challenging times. So I'll focus a little bit on youth entrepreneurship, and then towards the end, I'll bring in some other aspects that we want to talk about during this Youth Month. So you can skip to the next slide. So I just want to look at some data. I want to talk about NYDA's value chain for entrepreneurship, a little bit about our programs that we run, the disbursements that we do, and how we protect sustainability. And then I'll just touch on some of the campaigns that we're busy running at the moment. So if we look at youth entrepreneurship in South Africa, it's measured by international benchmarks, which measures total entrepreneurial activity. So if we look at our youth compared to Africa's average, we generally fall half of the African average, which is about 9% compared to 18% participation of our African counterparts. We also fall lower than most efficiency-driven economies, so those would be more of the economies in the developed world. The data also tells us that there's a correlation between education level and total entrepreneurial activity. Those who have completed secondary school, those who've completed tertiary education are much more likely both to participate in entrepreneurship and to succeed in entrepreneurship. And that's generally because we think the math and the literacy skills that they gain at school level assist them. Young men are more likely to be entrepreneurs than young women in the age group 25 to 34 years old. Now, I didn't put the slide on here, I probably should have, but in a study that we did with Harambee, and that's particularly in the job market, it's young women on average have 2 to 3 hours less a day to search for work and to search for opportunities. And that translates into the abilities that young women are able to access. Now, it's not, in our view, sufficient to simply set a target on one's APP and say 50% men, 50% women, 7% young people living with disabilities. It's particularly important that we do activities that reach out to vulnerable groups like young women. In that case, we've changed our strategy. Sorry. We've changed our strategy whereby we go directly into communities. We host specific women events whereby they can lodge their applications with the NYDA. We work through many community-based female organizations so that we have direct access to young women through organizations like Disabled Youth South Africa, because just expecting those people to walk into your offices is unlikely to translate into gender balances. It's also important to acknowledge that South African township youth are not necessarily responding to the full potential of business opportunities in their own communities. We know that proportionally immigrants have responded more effectively to employment and business opportunities. This was before COVID, but most youth will need to find employment in the informal sector. However, our labor force participation indicates that young people are not widely active in self-employed activities or being informally employed in micro-enterprises. So, for example, in Toon Townships, where we did a study, only 15% of micro-enterprises were run by young people who are under the age of 30. Of those, 1 in 3 young entrepreneurs were non-South Africans. For example, in Delft in Cape Town, 4 out of 10 hair salons and barbers were owned by young people, but 7 out of 10 were owned by foreign entrepreneurs. Generally, the most promising youth startups are in the lifestyle and leisure sectors, We find young entrepreneurs who are running those internet cafes, producing music at home, they're DJing, they're designing flyers, they're operating gyms, they're running takeaways. The study found that South Africans are majority owners of those kind of businesses, which tells you that South Africans navigate towards businesses that they know, they understand, and which they have skills in. Yeah, we can go on. So in terms of how NYD operates its value chain of entrepreneurship, we build awareness in our programs through outreach, through social media, through various campaigns. When young people approach us in terms of being an entrepreneur, we do a needs analysis of where they are in their life. Are they already running a business? Do they have an idea where they want to start up a business? Do they need financial support? Do they need non-financial support? And then once we've done that needs analysis, we plug them into business development support. As many colleagues will know, NYDA offers finance through grant disbursements of up to 250,000 Rand, but mainly our disbursements are between 50,000 and 100,000 Rand. We've moved away from loan financing into grant financing because we want to fund those entrepreneurs who are startups, who won't get funding anywhere else, who have very little collateral, and we truly do believe in the redistribution of income principle. Also, we're very much targeting micro enterprises, so those ones at the startup phase of their life. We pride ourselves on having strong aftercare and monitoring and evaluation. So after we've disbursed the grant, we don't want to leave the young person alone. We want to make sure we support them for 24 months through access to market, access to additional skills, and monitoring and evaluating what are the outcomes. Our access to market focuses on issues like market linkages. We also offer a mentor to all of the businesses that we support. Because of budgetary constraints, it's not always possible to be able to pay our mentors. So what we do is if we funded a business who is successful, because it was a grant and they didn't have to pay it back, we ask them to become a mentor to another business. In this way, we promote a cycle of social cohesion and spirit amongst entrepreneurs. We also plug into CEDA. CEDA has incubator programs, but they offer mainly non-financial support. So young people coming out of incubators who need funding can approach the NYDA. CEDA is also able to pay their mentors. So where they're able to allocate us a mentor, it makes a big difference. A big criticism is that government works in its silos. We do, as far as possible, try and work together. So for example, another example on CEDA, if a young person approaches the NYDA and has already done training with CEDA, we're happy to accept that training certificate. We don't re-put them through an entire training process. We're regularly working with the Department of Small Business. They're trying to get as many of the SMMEs through all of these relief funds housed on a centralized database, move them from the informal sector into the formal sector so that they can benefit from various government assistance and programs. We can go to the next slide. So to qualify for our grant program, you've got to be between 18 and 35. We support both entities and cooperatives, but you must be 100% South African owned. I've spoken about the financial commitment. They can operate either informally or formally, but they must be recognized as a micro enterprise. They must have a bank account. We can also provide them with assistance to open a bank account. We can go to the next slide. Okay, but I'll keep talking. In terms of the voucher program, we also have vouchers that we offer in services of IT, accounting, marketing services. Sorry. So those services, the voucher services assist us in a business that may be doing well, but for example, I think one of the previous presenters alluded to the fact that a micro business might not have the skills to run their own financials. So we provide them with a voucher that then assists them in being able to get the assistance that they may not have the skills for. Specifically to respond to COVID-19, we established a youth micro enterprise relief fund. So our view is that initially government and the private sector had established many funds, and we were referring many of our beneficiaries to those funds. But we did realize at some point in time that those micro businesses, a hair salon in a township or a gym that employs 1 or 2 people, doesn't seem to be really covered by the funds that exist. And we wanted to come up with a simplified process, a one-page application form, your last 3 months bank statements, and your CIPC certificate if you're formal, but we're willing to consider you if you're informal. And we wanted to give a grant capped at maximum of 10,000 Rand to subsidize your losses. Those who don't qualify, we refer them to the other funds. We've received about 4,500 applications. Yesterday when I checked, there was up to 6,000. We've approved about 226. Yesterday when I checked, that's above 450. We have space for about 1,000 businesses on that fund. We really do need the support from Treasury to scale up the fund. We've put it as a submission on the stimulus package. It was featured on TV, national and community-based radio stations as well. Yeah, this is just the process of applying for a grant. It generally starts at inquiry, move you to assessment. Generally, where it's required, we want you to go through our business management training. That's because we see really strong correlations between young people being trained through our training program, which is accredited by the ILO, and subsequent success in their business. You then make an application, we do due diligence, moves to approval, contracting, disbursement, aftercare, and support. I've spoken about the voucher program. We can skip to the next slide. We can skip to the next one. Yeah, this is just a beneficiary story that I thought I'll share. So this is a young person or two young sisters who really do a lot of great work. They manufacture household goods and they are able to sell their products on Amazon, Takealot, many other international sites. Yeah, they applied to the relief fund. They got 10,000 Rand from the NYDA. They were able to pivot their entire business. They're now manufacturing masks. They got an order from Sasol, and they've translated the 10,000 Rand that they got to 21,000 Rand in just one day's order. So some good stories coming out of, and we really do believe in these micro businesses. Yeah, the ability to learn fast, be resilient, and scale their business models. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so a big campaign that the NYDA was running was to fund 1,000 youth-owned enterprises in 100 days. So in SONA 2020, the president announced probably the most comprehensive youth employment plan in South Africa's history, the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. And this plan sets out 5 priorities over the next 5 years to take 3 million young people out of unemployment and into the labor market and into aspects of self-employment. To kickstart the youth employment intervention, we wanted to fund 1,000 enterprises in 100 days. We were affected by the hard lockdown and we had to suspend disbursements, but we're back up and running from level 3. Our original intention was to announce the 1,000 on June 16th. We'll be announcing 500 on June 16th, but that means there's still space for another 500 to be funded. When I looked at the stats yesterday, we were 53% male, 47% female-owned businesses, and we have a balance on all our targets. So there's more space for female-owned businesses in the next 2 months. We want to announce the 1,000 businesses on June 6th. Oh, sorry, not June 16th, on August 12th, which is International Youth Day. Yeah, before I conclude, I guess COVID-19 has made us think a lot about youth development, about young men, young women, and about this restructuring of the economy and how we do it. I think it's no secret to say that even before COVID-19, South Africa had the worst youth unemployment rate in the world. So as much as we've made gains as the democratic state, one area where we've really failed is integrating our young people into the economy. And it's the saddest thing because you have all of these young people who have energy and who have passion and they want to work, but you leave them on the sidelines. And then we express concern when those young people fall into drug or substance abuse or other social ills. So the question we kind of need to ask ourselves is, how do we do things differently in a new economy? And what we've been thinking about as the presidency and as NYDA is, if you've got multitudes of young people who want to work, and the truth of the matter is 80% of young people want a job, yeah? And them having a job between the ages of 18 and 25 is better because it enables them to be better entrepreneurs if they want to be in the future. But if you have all of these young people who want to work, and you have work that needs to be done in the economy, I don't think anybody can argue that there's work to be done, work for the common good that needs to be done in South Africa. Then shouldn't we have something like a minimum employment guarantee? And the community works program was originally envisaged to become the base for what would be a minimum employment guarantee. And in my view, that is something we need to pursue. Every young person should have the guarantee of employment. And I think that will go a long way to restoring young people's dignity. It will go a long way in growing South Africa and reducing many of the social ills that we face. So thank you very much, Program Director. That's my presentation. I'll leave it at that.
I think that was profound, like any other presentation preceding this one. And can I then take this opportunity to invite everyone who wants to contribute to this agenda of economic empowerment and inclusivity by show of hand? I would really want to propose that we take the first 3 hands of contributors, and should the need arise, then we'll then take the following hands or group of people or person who still wants to contribute. But also I'm being cognizant of the fact that the actual formal program was scheduled to end at 11 a.m. sharp. We are already 12 minutes beyond that. In particular, myself, I've got a meeting for 12 o'clock, which I still need to prepare for. So I would propose that in the interest of time, maybe we can indulge with this work till say about 11:30 or thereabout. Charlene, over to you. And can you then recognize, and just to again make an appeal that when you raise your hand, you tell us who you are and from which department or state-owned enterprise or which organization, right? So that we are able to contextualize the discussion that we are going to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. We have Pearl's iPhone, whose hand is raised. Pearl's iPhone.
Yes, my name is Peli Sankomo. I'm a development economist, and I'm part of South African Women in Dialogue. And thank you so much for such a combination of presentations, which really reflects the discourse around the women's exclusion in the economy. I mean, I think it's a huge issue, and with COVID, I think the impact is going to be even more immense. But what I was thinking that we probably need to add as we go forward, I just want to emphasize the point around access to data for women, and as well as I think for youth as well. I think it's something that we need to really invest time in terms of disaggregating, so that we fully understand the gains that we're making, and also even if there's any progress in any case. I think from a youth perspective, I do think that there needs to be more investment on, and I think the point the last speaker from NYD makes, it's around that young people, participate in business on the basis of the knowledge and what I call minimal skills they have. And the danger really about that is that if entrepreneurs and interact with the economy with such minimal skills, is that we're going to continue to have a middle income trap in South Africa. That there must be an investment, from a deliberate policy intervention to train young people on entrepreneurship. And this should be integrated as part of the education system, both in high school and university. And I think it's something that NYDA needs to. I mean, I've been exposed to the work they've been doing in the last 15 years. They've lost a lot of money because some of it is actually, they invest and they never see the investment. But also fundamentally is to ensure that young people don't only participate in service-orientated sector, because service-orientated sector is a moving target. It's informed by consumer needs and consumer demand, but it's also starting to look at the manufacturing component to ensure that young people are in the production of products that get used inside of the service. I think that's one contribution I'd like to make. I think when it comes to, with women, there's something that is much bigger, which I didn't hear is that one of the key things we really need to recognize around, particularly I want to comment on both the presentation on the procurement, but I think partly in touch as well what Ayanda was saying, is that we need to look at the size of our economy. And I think we need to be realistic about other things as well. Is that we must talk about where are women catered in terms of business. Because if we're able to do that, then we need to be able to say what type of support then do we provide. And I just want to stick, for example, during the COVID period, and we're likely to be in the space for the next 18 to 24 months around food production and the role of women in food production, the value chain, what opportunities that are presented there. And even if you would undertake even now spending on food during this period where a lot of citizens are not productive, but there's a volume of procurements, either from the state or the private sector, where it's going to. So I do think that we need to, while we talk about overall data, but we need to start doing a sectoral disaggregation of data. Because then if we do that, then we're then going to be able to say, so that we don't apply one size fits all from an intervention. And we need to understand the complexities of per economic sector or industry, so that we're able to push, to support women, but at the same time, push for actually a very achievable, practical, or tangible intervention. I think just the last point, I do think that we truly need to invest in the area of township economy. Townships must become productive centers, not consumption centers. So part of exactly what we probably need to start doing in this conversation, perhaps next time, is to talk about the role of municipalities, because municipalities, and we've seen actually even during COVID, where municipalities are procuring services outside of the communities, but also procuring services. I mean, simple masks, for instance, overalls, etc. And I do think that you're not going to be able to complete this conversation. This is my last point, without talking about the structure of our economy. Because if, for instance, there is no deliberate intervention in ensuring that we increase our risk appetite, investing, for example, municipalities must be able now to invest in swing projects within their own, because the demand for PEP is likely to be around for the next 18 months too. And I think we need to think about what are the short-term, medium-term opportunities for women. And that's the agility we need to start adopting. But if we think that we're going to use the current procurement framework from a public sector, even the bill that is in Parliament, it doesn't have that agility. But we need to be able to think and to push for much more, very dynamic procurement. The last issue I'd really like us to put on our radar is private sector procurement. We've not been able to do. Private sector procurement has not transformed. Look at the BEE, the reports that get submitted. Let's take time to look and just look at exactly what's going on from a spending perspective and how private sector companies actually even budget for the punitive financing they're meant to make, particularly knowing that they won't be able to meet the targets. Thank you very much, colleagues. That's my contribution.
Thank you so much. Program Director, next I have is Mtabi Singh Moleko. Mtabi Singh.
Hi, thank you. Yes, thanks. My name is Mtabi Singh Moleko. I'm an economist who's a commissioner at the CGE. Thanks to all the presenters for the presentations. I think that the common thread that we're raising is the same thread that we've raised, I think, consistently throughout the democratic dispensation. I think the first thing is that one of the things that I think I want to just point out is it points to probably the issue of instruments. I think one of the things that Pedis has just raised is the public procurement bill. I think we need to revisit the instruments that are being used to advance industrialization, the instruments that are used to advance, I'd say, active participation of those who have been previously either excluded or disadvantaged or face high level of economic barriers to entry in various subsectors of the economy. So I think that one of the recommendations that even the CGE presentation that Marissa made was a rethink and a relook at some of those instruments, but I think in more detail. I would probably want to zoom in to say that the DTI, and I know there's a lady from the DTI BBE who mentioned that she was part of the call. There's been various incentives. There's tax concessions, there's like infrastructure support. There've been hundreds of funds like the Jobs Fund. There's enterprise development support to specifically the auto sector through the MIDP and APDP, and various other programs that have been billions of rands in the fiscus. If you look at the allocation towards some of the incentives in the manufacturing sector. But the problem is that when you look at the follow through and the lead to what is the result, or what is the effect, you'd find that one, youth unemployment, as the NYDA would already have identified, more on the enterprise perspective, but if you look at the effect, is that there's very little in terms of absorption of labor, even from a perspective of labor, let alone enterprise development supply. Sorry. Enterprise development supply in the value chain has been very minimal. And so you're finding that the actual effect of, that was my niece, the actual effect of the incentives themselves and the programs themselves has been minimal in terms of actually changing, one, the value chain and the distribution along the value chain, but two, including those who have been previously disadvantaged. And I think we need to revisit quite seriously the actual mechanisms that are used. I think that the data issue has really been emphasized by a lot of the speakers. I think that the data issue for me is a question of how do we make sure that National Treasury and all the other, particularly private sector, which is not willing to participate in enterprise supply development programs to the level that they should, but also the mandatory requirements of the acts that are not being actually enforced. And I think we need to look at how do we then enforce, not just from a compliance perspective, but really to try and transform the value chains. I think the first or the second speaker, Jose, she mentioned the 1 trillion that is in listed companies in the procurement value chain, but also the public sector has about 500 billion in the value in the public sector bill, and yet we are not seeing the gains, and not even from a reporting perspective, but I think from the perspective of the allocation sufficiently to these subsectors. So I think more and more we need to really enforce, and I think that the policy instruments that we're using need to probably be relooked. I think that the third point I'd make is, just to close, is I'd drive for massive productive sector input from youth and woman-owned enterprises, and I think industrialization is probably the way to go if we're going to try and incorporate particularly new businesses into these subsectors and into the mainstream economy. And I think more support needs to be enabled from the side of finance and access to finance, but also to provide linkages to the value chain, particularly in agriculture and manufacturing. But I think these things need a new way of looking at things. We can't just go on, close this discussion, continue business as usual. I think the country is at a point of crisis economically. What is likely to be the effect of the COVID-19 on an already country that had an economic recession, more than 10 million people unemployed, small businesses on the verge of closing down because of the pressures they now face, in addition to COVID, is really catastrophic for our economy. And I think we need to really just look at ways in which to propel and make sure that there's policy alignment, changes in terms of instruments, and effective programs that are actually utilized by the state and the private sector so that we can see change rapidly and more decisively. Thank you so much, and sorry for those disturbances.
Thank you, Ntabi Singh. Michael, you wanted to proceed, and then Ranji after that. Michael?
Thank you very much, Shalon. I think for me, it's just to note a number of discussions, obviously, and pointers that the colleagues have indicated. And of course, what the program director alluded to earlier on. One being towards ensuring that we report accordingly in terms of the targeted groups that we have been talking about. Secondly, and most importantly, I think we, at least working from CIFA's point of view, there needs to be that sort of targeted approach in ensuring, obviously, that there's inclusion of women in particular in the economy. I remember one question earlier came from Mapule, if I'm not mistaken, regarding women cooperatives. In as much as we do support and assist cooperatives, obviously it's safe to say that there are a number of dynamics that we find within cooperatives, but safe to say again that between CEDA and the Department of Small Business Development, and I know quite well that in the latter months of the previous financial year, there's been a number of engagements to basically try and streamline support towards cooperatives and ensuring, of course, that the inclusion more so on women cooperatives actually happens. But obviously, this financial year, there hasn't been much of any movement, obviously, given the pandemic that we're sitting in right now. Ayanda did mention earlier the fact that she would love to see, the results or the impact of COVID-19 intervention as far as CIFA is concerned in relation to reporting against women enterprises. Safe to say, and I would love to indicate, of course, that as far as the debt relief fund is concerned, it's still work in progress at this point in time. Our colleagues in-house here are basically working 24/7 to ensure that they convert the approvals into disbursements. And of course, I want to believe that the reports will be shared, particularly to our department, which will then be publicized on the various platforms. I like what Wasim said in terms of ensuring that we try and work together, closely rather, as far as both private and public organizations are concerned. Because we find indeed that in many instances, NYDA, CIFA, CEDA, or any other agency for that matter might actually be doing something that the other doesn't even or is not even aware of, to an extent possible where you find that there could actually be potential duplications and overlaps. So I'm glad to indicate, of course, that part of last financial year's announcements made by our Minister of Small Business Development, whilst she was launching, among others, the Small Business and Innovation Fund, was to also launch what we call the common template. Now, this common template has to do with applications, or at least trying to ensure that applicants access this so-called common template, which will give them access to CIFA, pretty much all the DFIs, including your IDCs, but most importantly, to ensure that where there are non-financial gaps, then CEDA basically taps into that. So it would be a common template, but that basically any applicant, any SMME can actually access, and within that very platform, the various sort of agencies or organizations can basically are able to tap into the information that the applicant would have completed in there. So it's one of those things to ease this sort of, call it overlaps or working in silos, if you like. I think from my side, I pretty much have actually noted, of course, the discussions, and I want to appeal, obviously, to the broad audience, and in particular, program director, that if we could have, obviously, a follow-up on these discussions to basically try and, find alignment and common impact going forward. I have noted, whilst the meeting was continuing, the financial inclusion framework of the department, and I realized that this is dated 2019, and I realized that there were engagements with some stakeholders in terms of this framework. And I would love to appeal, obviously, that going forward, if this framework can actually be made available to everybody. I've managed to access it online, so I just want to recommend or propose that colleagues can actually make reference to that particular document. It looks quite handy to, you know, the discussions around the table like this today. I thank you very much all.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much. This is Ranji. You can hear me, right?
We hear you, Ranji. Please, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Ranji Reddy from the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. I'm actually in the Research and Policy Unit, for colleagues that don't know me. Thank you very much for the presentations. I found them really useful. I've been recording a lot of notes. Firstly, to start, we would find it useful, Shalene, if you could share all the presentations with us. I have just a couple of points that may be question points, I'm not sure. But I just want to start off by saying that we tend to focus a lot on SMMEs. And given, now I'm speaking from the gender angle, given that Ayanda mentioned that the number of SMMEs that are women-owned or led or employed is actually decreasing. And, you know, with us trying to then continue on the track we are, we could then continue to have these challenges we're facing. Perhaps we need to rethink on a strategy on how we go about moving into different terrains. For example, I'll come back to the SMMEs, but for example, we might want to consider how we tap into the opportunities that are presenting now within the big industry. We need to look at procurement within the big industry and how that will open opportunities for women and younger persons and persons with disabilities in terms of the value chains within the big industry, and then you know, grow those businesses. What we tend to do also at this point in time is we tend to have this perspective that that women and young persons need to come to the funding agency or to NYDA or to Small Business Development Department. I think we need to move into a strategy of how do we go out there in a bigger way. I know that we are doing this in some way, but I'm suggesting now that we probably have to look at a bigger approach and a more forceful approach, is we go out there to get the businesses. Now, one of the things that we need to use that is a spin-off from the COVID-19 response is the database that was being created by Department of Social Development for the Social Distress Relief Fund. Because they obviously have now captured all those that applied and required funding. And we need to now use that kind of information and say, we want to go to the youth and say, we have this opportunity or whatever. The second thing about big business, I think we need to actively approach big businesses and bring them on board to say, can you mentor X number of young people in this area? So we actually link that process with the database, and we get the young people into this kind of mentoring situation so that they can then access whatever opportunities in terms of funding to start businesses in the opportunities in the big business procurement. I want to move on to the area of how do we create and use the opportunities that are coming out of COVID-19 in developing our young people into entrepreneurship or businesses, etc. You know, we don't tend to focus too much on recycling, and I think there's huge opportunities in recycling, and I'm hoping that Wazim could actually look at that. We need to look at what are the opportunities that are suddenly presented by the 41,000 water tanks and water tankers that are now out there. There's opportunities arising for various job opportunities. We also don't look at, in this country, much on using young people as au pairs or after school care. We always rely on after school care as in the school itself. But we need to start looking at how do we get young people to create these little jobs for themselves, that they can begin to look and pick up children and drop children. University students could do this. There's a lot of opportunities there. There's opportunities in fashion. One of the things I'm thinking of is how much of masks can we actually produce? Everyone is now jumping into mask production. It's good enough for 18 months, but then what happens to these jobs after that? So we might want to look at the short term, but then have a little longer term. You know, for example, the other day on television, I was watching a Nigerian young woman who took the mask thing into a fashion issue. And I think there's scope for that. I'm looking at opportunities in salons, restaurants, spas, given the COVID-19 situation. What specific needs are they going to be putting in place in terms of protocols that will have spin-off for job creations? So these are just some of the opportunities I think that we need to now approach the young people and begin to work on this, rather than just wait for them to come up with their own ideas as well. And the last point I want to raise, and this is particular to Mr. Boy, I think that these are very critical issues that really need to be mainstreamed across the ASAP cluster, but particularly now within the work streams and government processes, or else we're going to lose the whole opportunity. It's to really push all of these issues very strongly into the COVID response process. Thank you very much, Charlene and Mr. Boy.
Thank you very much for this very dynamic engagement, and to all the presenters and also the people that have contributed. There is quite a number of issues that were raised, and actually, like at some point I was sort of jumping on my chair, actually, like really saying, you know, like, I mean, some of the things, they are just on point. You know, like, I mean, there's a lady that actually like spoke from UN. I think she said quite a number of very positive things that, you know, if we can actually like really look at unpacking those aspects, like things like, you know, looking at the size of the economy, what is the role of women in the food production, and what opportunities are there? And then like getting the sectoral disaggregated data, and like really understanding the complexities of the different sectors, and then saying how do we position women within there. On the aspect of, you know, like, I mean, the township businesses, we also had an opportunity of engaging with the Gauteng Economic Development as well, where we were actually like saying that, you know, it's about time that the township businesses, it's not really more around services. How do we actually like really create sustainable businesses from the things that are actually like really consumed within the townships, and how do we support those particular initiatives? And I mean, maybe just going back to also the other lady that actually came from CGE, saying that, you know, we are having a lot of instruments that we are actually like using to advance industrialization. And maybe it's about time that we pause a bit and like sort of say, how do we strengthen the instruments, and how do we coordinate in such a way that we actually like really get the intended outcome? And I think coordination becomes like a key thing that you know, becomes important in this particular instance. You know, before this particular Zoom meeting, I actually like wanted some colleagues from the incentive side to also come and participate in terms of this webinar. And when I sort of interfaced with them, they actually said, you know, one of the key things that they are battling with from the incentive division is that what are the current challenges that are being experienced by women in accessing the current incentives that are there, so that we can actually like really start to remove all those blockages to ensure that, you know, what is available can be accessible to these particular women. And the disaggregated data also is like, I mean, a key challenge. And we are beginning to actually like really say, how do we make sure that as we interface with our different stakeholders, we also get this disaggregated data. And also within the incentives, they have started with the process of also trying to get the disaggregated data in terms of the incentives that they offer from the DTI, so that we can know how many of this incentive budget goes to women-owned enterprises, how many of it goes to people living with disability or even youth-owned enterprises. And then maybe lastly, just to touch on what Mr. Boy actually like really said earlier on, that, you know, we are moving, and we are moving at quite a fast pace where we are now supposed to be grappling with issues that are supposed to advance women, youth, and people living with disability, economic participation. And at the same time, you know, we need to actually like really not just look at South Africa, but look at Africa as a continent, taking into consideration that now we have signed the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And like, I mean, we should be saying now, how do we interface in such a way that as we go along, we are also ensuring that we are integrated seamlessly within, you know, the bigger value chain of an African continent perspective. And then lastly, from the Kasim, there is like a YES initiative that is actually like under the BBBE. It may be quite interesting for us to maybe interface further, just to see how do we actually like also utilize this instrument to advance, you know, like, I mean, youth employment. And not just for the companies to just have this youth for a period of a year, but find a way of saying the skills that are being developed, how do we integrate them within the economy? And how do we actually like really also support this youth so that, you know, like, I mean, eventually they can also be, you know, like, I mean, enterprises that can be developed at a later stage, or they can also start their own businesses, and they are not just like sort of put into the chain of, you know, allowing companies to give them experience. After 12 months, they are out, and then another group of young people, because like ultimately that is not sustainable. That is not giving the transformation that we actually like really require within the economy. That's my 2 cents worth. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Nomvula. Mr. Boy, over to you for closure.
Can everyone hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues, particularly or specifically to those who contributed to the main program. I'm really falling short of words to really extend my gratitude to all of you, not forgetting those who came in as contributors. I've already indicated that every contribution was so profound. However, I just want to highlight the big issues which will certainly go into the report, and it's not going to be a report that's just going to be produced and packed at the back somewhere in our offices to gather dust. I'm really talking about moving everything towards implementation and integrating everything. I think there was a big call for access to data to unlock the opportunity, the economic opportunities for everyone, specifically the young, the old, and the disabled women. There was also a call for more investment to be made in favor of youth, taking into consideration that they are the future. There was also a big call towards mainstreaming entrepreneurship, right? To be part of our education system so that we do not remain like a nation which is trapped in entering the economy just through one loop, which is services, but also building or scaling up those capabilities into manufacturing, because manufacturing can only cement our economic status. But also, I think one other view which really came in very profoundly was that in our design for interventions, whether we call them proposals, we always need to be guided by the fact that there's not just one size fit all. And I think we've already talked quite a lot around the diversity that exists, even amongst women themselves. The other view that we really have to put into our implementation metrics is also to be cognizant of the fact that the majority of the people that we really want to get out of that poverty trap, they're in that space designed specially by the old apartheid system, which is township, rural economy. And I think the speaker there was very profound in making the fact or point that we need to turn our townships and rural areas, including villages, into spaces where we shall play, live, and work. The other call which was made was really to make sure that in our intervention in terms of developing this new thinking, new economy, new ways of doing things, right? And again, there's a very good opportunity presented by COVID-19 that we should always design our plans or strategies into fit to what we shall then call short-term, medium, and long-term plans. And again, in the work that we do, we should not just focus on the government or public sector. We should be cognizant of the fact that there's a private sector and there's a lot of activity happening there, which somehow we're not tracking enough as government. The other point which was made is that we should now move away or out of the lull of just being reactive, but we really need to be proactive, right, in terms of designing the interventions that we spoke about. But to me, the biggest take home would be the point which was made by one of our contributors or speakers that seeks to underscore the point that it's about time that we move the economic activity in terms of the focus to refocus on local government or at a municipal area, because this is where delivery takes place. And as they will say, call face of delivery. There was a point which was made, I think, by my colleague, Nomvula from the DTIC about incentive schemes. I think I've got my team here as we're seated in the same bedroom or boardroom. Did I say bedroom? Sorry, boardroom. That we had done some work in terms of the incentive scheme, and the report shall be shared, which certainly would also make our work coherent. And I think in my concluding remark is certainly to say, thank you very much. And I think from here, we are all going to endeavor to make sure that no one is left behind. Shalene, special thanks to you. You've been a good host. And of course, everyone else who up to this hour, you stood, I'm sure, and you also moved, and also allowing me specifically into your special spaces. Colleagues, I'm sure you'll hear from us. I would really want to say, can this meeting at this point be adjourned as I move to the next meeting in my own language? Nda.